According to legend, two green children wandered into a village in 12th century Suffolk. No one knew who they were or where they came from. Their refusal to eat an unfamiliar language made locals wary. Over time, they gradually assimilated and told a fantastic story of their origins. Were they fairies, lost children with big imaginations, extraterrestrials, the fever dream of medieval chroniclers? Let's take a look in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. Before we dive into this third instalment of Miscellaneous Month, I do obviously want to address the fact that there have been obviously these horrible wildfires in LA, and I didn't mention them last week because of the time of the week that I actually recorded the episode, so it was sort of done before everything happened. As I did when there was the hurricanes, I have actually put some links to different organisations in the show notes where you can find more information for mutual aid, or if you want to donate to help like the fire department or say the animal shelters that are taking in animals while people are evacuating and so on. So I have put some links in the show notes if you would like to help and you're not really quite sure how, because it's one of those situations where you sort of feel a bit like you're watching helplessly on TV and you would like to do something. So if you can contribute, then obviously the links are there. And if you can't financially contribute, obviously please do feel free just to pass them on and help other people see that they are available. So if you have been caught up in that, I'm so sorry for everything that's happening. My cousin actually lives in Los Angeles and he has been evacuated, although at the time that I'm recording this, he is fine. He's just not at home. So hopefully they'll all get it under control soon and people can then start seeing whether they can go home or not. So if you have been affected, I am really so sorry. And Fabulous Folklore is here in any way that it can be helpful. And I'm not really sure that it can be, but, you know, our thoughts are with you if that is something that will be of comfort to you. The other thing is a completely different change of pace, and that is I'm so glad I did the dowsing episode last week because so many of you have been leaving really cool comments on the YouTube video and I've had them on the blog post and things like that where you've actually been dowsing. It's awesome. I had no idea so many people were still dowsing, and I'm really pleased to see that not only are people keeping the practice alive but that it actually seems to work. So that was really cool. So thank you very much for those comments. I will be including them anonymously in the book that I said I'm writing about divination because it just demonstrates that there is this lived tradition as part of dowsing or water witching or whatever you want to call it. And I love the fact that folklore, obviously, like I've said a few times, isn't just this old thing from the past. It's what we're continuing to do now. I also love the number of people who had learned it from a relative and it had passed down through the family. I also thought that was really cool. So thank you very much to everyone who left comments. If you'd like to leave a comment, obviously the episode is still there for you to do so. It's much easier to leave comments on YouTube, it seems. But there we go. You can also leave them on the blog post that is linked in the show notes. So that was the dowsing episode last week. So thank you very much for everyone who left comments. And as I say, it's been really genuinely interesting hearing from people's lived experience of dowsing. So that is very cool. Naturally, it made me want to go and have a look. But knowing me, I'll dig through something I shouldn't. So I probably won't bother. But anyway, I did say that this week we would be having a look at the Green Children of Woolpit because it's quite a famous story in English folklore. And I can't believe I've never covered it before. And I thought, well, why not? This is the miscellaneous month. It doesn't have to fit in with anything else this month. So there we go. So we're heading off to Woolpit in Suffolk. And actually the name comes from its old English name, which was Woolpit, because it actually had a pit to catch wolves. It literally is that simple. The village does also have another odd claim to fame because people apparently went there on pilgrimages in the medieval era because they wanted to visit Our Lady of Woolpit's well, which was behind the church, which could apparently heal eye diseases. So I thought that was quite interesting because you know how much I do love a good well story. But back to the legend. Rolf of Coggeshall, a monk in Essex, included the story in his Chronicon Anglicanum, try saying that quickly, dating it to have happened within living memory. In the story, the villagers discovered two green-skinned children near the wolf pit. Acting strangely, they spoke an unintelligible language. The The villagers took them to Sir Richard de Colney's home, but they repeatedly refused food. Unsure what to do with them, Sir Richard gave them the run of the house, and a few days after they arrived, they discovered green beans in the garden and happily tucked in. Now, the children stayed there for a few years, and over time they gradually began to eat a wider range of food, and the less green food they ate, the more they lost their green skin tone until they just looked like the other villagers. Sir Richard also taught them English, and eventually someone asked them where they'd come from. Now, the children didn't know how they'd ended up in Suffolk, but it does seem that they'd travelled through a cavern to get there. Now, it is worth noting at this point that stories of people passing through caves and ending up in the other world are not unique in folklore. Gervase of Tilbury recalled a tale in which a swineherd in Derbyshire entered Peak Cavern looking for a pig when he ended up in a land in which the seasons were inverted. And in Northumberland, we also have the legend of Hen Hole, in which the cavern apparently leads to the other world, although the local fairies are more likely to lure you in with music than you are to wander in by accident. Now, his is not the only version, because the other version that we have is by the 12th century chronicler William of Newburgh. Now, you might remember him as being a bit of a friend of the podcast, because he also recorded the legends of the Annick, Berwick and Melrose vampires and a fairy encounter near Willie Howe. Now, given the fact that William of Newburgh was in Yorkshire and Ralph of Coggeshall was in Essex, which is obviously nearer Woolpit in Suffolk, some sources do suggest that William got his version from Ralph, although Michael Madej notes that William wrote his version first because he died in around 1198 and Ralph wrote his version in the 1220s. Now, Madej doubts either of them used the other's work due to the stylistic and linguistic differences, although he does suggest that they used the same original source. William dates his version to occur during King Stephen's reign, which was between 1135 and 1154, and he says that the children found themselves in the fields where the reapers worked to bring in the harvest, and they were not found by the Woolpit. His account doesn't specify them coming through a cavern, only that, and I quote, "On a certain day, when we were feeding our father's flocks in the fields, we heard a great sound, such as we are now accustomed to hear at St. Edmund's when the bells are chiming. And whilst listening to the sound in admiration, we became on a sudden, as it were, entranced, and found ourselves among you in the fields where you were reaping." End quote. And in this version, they explain that they came from the land of St. Martin. Now, in William's version, they were, and I quote, "completely green in their persons, and clad in garments of a strange colour and unknown materials." End quote. Once they were taken to the village by the reapers with, and I quote, "many persons coming to see so novel a sight, they were kept some days without food." End quote. And William suggests that they actually didn't get the chance to eat, and they would only tolerate beans straight from the pod. He also never mentions Sir Richard in his version. William also cites that the children explained that in their land the sun never rose and they lived in an eternal twilight. Another land lay on the other side of a river from their land, and this other land was described as luminous. Now, someone took the children to a local church to be baptised, although the boy died shortly after, apparently following some kind of illness. The girl took the name of Agnes and, according to William, eventually married someone from King's Lynn, and it seems that they had at least one child, if you believe his account. So did it really happen? It is difficult to say what really happened or if it even happened at all. Now, William of Newburgh certainly thought so, because he said, and I quote, "Let everyone say as he pleases and reason on such matters according to his abilities. I feel no regret at having recorded an event so prodigious and miraculous." End quote. Now, Madej suggests that medieval chroniclers saw history differently and that God lay behind everything that happened. So as a result, they would include bizarre things in their chronicles like revelations or supernatural phenomena, essentially as some kind of indication that God was orchestrating all of it anyway. Furthermore, St. Augustine took the position that the greatest miracle was the world's very existence, so anything that happened within it was a form of miracle. That made anything and everything worthy of the chronicler's notice. However, William of Camden thought it was a hoax in his Britannia of 1586, and humanist Robert Burton suggested that the children came from the moon. You know, as you do. Folklorist Thomas Keightley brought it to the wider public's attention in 1850 when it appeared in fairy mythology, and it's at this point that the children become fairies, although that could be due to the Victorian fixation on fairies as being childlike, which obviously if you look at the earlier folklore, no, that is not what's going on. This was also the first time that the stories included English translations of the original Latin accounts, which at least made them more accessible to a wider range of people, and then people assumed that the story must be some kind of older folk tale as a result. In relating the story in 1870, John Murray noted that, and I quote, "The bell ringing, the river and the green colour of the children all belong to the true old fairy mythology," end quote. And I think at this point it really demonstrates how that fairy motif has taken hold. Now, the passage through a cave to reach a different land does suggest the other world, yes, which does raise the possibility that the children were fairy children, and their green skin tone certainly could feed that interpretation of the story, since green is obviously a fairy colour. But it does seem strange that no one then appeared to come looking for them if that was the case. That said, there are also various tales within British folklore of humans marrying fairy-like creatures, such as selkies or mermaids, and producing children. And looking for a supernatural ancestor is quite an ancient business, with families in France claiming descent from Melusine, but there doesn't really seem to be the same rush to claim Agnes as a fairy ancestor from her descendants, so I think it's quite interesting that there isn't a tradition of saying that you descended from the fairy person from Woolpit, which you would imagine that there would be had that been the case, which is why I think the fairy thing only comes in 1850, and that's why there isn't that story, which sort of, to me, would actually disprove the fairy idea. Now, one theory for the children's identity was a lot more mundane than you might think, and here the children were apparently the children of Flemish immigrants. Somehow they'd been separated from their parents and they ended up in Woolpit. Their Flemish language would have sounded alien to the villagers. Their green skin may have been from malnourishment, which explained why they gained a regular skin tone after eating regular food. However, Madej points out that the Battle of Fornham St Martin, when 3,000 Flemish mercenaries were killed, happened in 1173, which would explain why all of a sudden these children didn't have parents anymore, but William of Newburgh suggested the children were found between 1135 and 1154, so there wasn't really any reason why they would have been separated from their parents. Madej also points out that malnutrition would have been common in 12th century England, so green skin wouldn't have been unusual enough to have been commented on. Another somewhat strange theory sees the story as an early version of the Babes in the Wood legend, and I have an exclusive episode on that if anyone's interested on Patreon. Here, a wicked uncle poisoned the children with arsenic rather than just abandoning them in the woods, and they survived, but the arsenic turned them green. Yes, arsenic does have an input into green, particularly Shields green, which was a really popular colour in the Victorian era, but I don't know, that story just doesn't really ring true with me at all. Madej offers a theory that William of Newburgh's version is actually an allegory of the transition from the Saxon era to the establishment of an English identity following the arrival of the Normans. So the girl's bewilderment at her predicament, her need to learn a new language and eat different food, that then goes on to represent this turbulent transition. Her assimilation reflects the way in which the Normans disappeared into the population in England. By comparison, Ralph of Coggeshall was writing during the Fourth Crusade, and may have used the story as an allegory to warn people to be watchful for anyone that was different. So, I mean, any of those are possible, really, apart from the arsenic one, I think, for various reasons. But there's one particular part of the story that I always end up kind of catching on to, and I think it's the significance of St Martin, because in William of Newburgh's account, he was, and I quote, regarded with peculiar veneration in the country which gave them birth, end quote. They do specify that the land from which they came was Christian, and it did have churches, which would partially rule out the idea of them being fairies. Now, I know when Rose Aurora came on and she was telling us that in Scandinavian lore, elves can and do present as Christian, that isn't necessarily something that we see quite so much in English folklore. So I can't help thinking that if they say they come from a land which is Christian, it's probably more likely that it's not the fairy otherworld. Now, St Martin has popped up a couple of times on the podcast, but his feast day or Martinmas falls on 11th of November. In the Middle Ages, Martinmas was incredibly important in Germanic regions because it marked the end of the harvest season. So his origin is pretty interesting, since Martin of Tours was a Roman soldier who converted to Christianity as an adult. In his best known legend, he met a beggar in the winter dressed only in rags. Because he'd already given away most of his other clothing to other beggars, he then basically cuts his cloak in half with a sword and then gives half of it to the beggar. And then that night he dreams of Jesus wearing the half cloak. St Martin was the patron saint of Groningen and Utrecht, and Martinmas was a popular feast in Flanders. So does that detail support the theory that these were Flemish children? And perhaps the perpetual twilight refers to the dimness of the country in their memory, while the very considerable river was actually the channel. There is also the idea that's literally just popped into my head as well, the fact that if Martinmas marks the end of the harvest season, isn't it interesting that they then turn up when there's reapers in the field? Now, Medea notes the work of Anne Witt, who suggested St Martin's Land to be the underworld rather than the other world. And apparently she reached this conclusion because Martinmas fell 9 days after All Souls' Day on November the 2nd, which would give him a vague link with the dead. According to Medea, broad beans had been a symbol of death for centuries, although they were a bread replacement during famine, and people ate them during the Lent fast. Now, I'm not convinced by this theory, particularly because in some legends the dead live in the other world alongside other supernatural beings, so I don't necessarily know how helpful it is to try and separate the underworld and the other world, but that's probably beside the point. So what do we ultimately make of the story of the Green Children of Woolpit? Well, there is the possibility that the children invented their own origin story, because this is the thing. Everybody just takes what the kids say as being absolute truth, and very few of the accounts go, maybe not. Maybe they've just made that up. And because while William of Newburgh quotes them directly, he didn't directly interview the children, so it's difficult to necessarily know what it was that they actually said. So how do we know that some of this hasn't gotten garbled in the retelling? Camden might have been correct and it might have all been a hoax. Perhaps they were fairies or fugitives from the land of the dead or Flanders. Other people think that they might have been aliens, and at least advanced technology might explain the sudden appearance of the children. Maybe both monks really did use the story as an allegory to work through something that preoccupied them at the time. Other folklorists also suggested that the story was an old oral tale that then influenced Ralph and William's telling. But I think in some ways it feels like who the Green Children were matters less than the way that the story has caught the popular imagination. Because there's no way to prove any of the theories, it sort of almost doesn't really matter. And I think the fact that we have all the theories and collecting all the theories is good enough. We don't necessarily have to pick which one we prefer or which one we think is more likely. I still can't help thinking that a lot of it is just a story that has then been passed on as true for one reason or another. And it might be an allegory, it might just be somebody invented it and then it got passed on. Who knows? And I think that because there's enough in there that people are trying to go, well, what's the reasonable explanation for this? A lot of those theories aren't compatible with each other. So it then leads us into a situation where we have a story that we can't work out, and I think that just really annoys humans, basically. I would like to know what your favourite theory is, though, because obviously everybody is entitled to interpret it whichever way that they want, based on the information that is available, particularly in William's version, and that one is available online in English, and I have linked that in the blog post that this episode accompanies, which you'll find in the show notes, so it might be interesting if you want to have a read of it yourself. It's really short. And like I said, I love William of Newburgh because he'd be like, here's a regular historical thing and here's another regular historical thing. And oh my God, there's vampires. Here's another historical thing. And I just love him for that. I think he's brilliant. And he just records some really interesting things. And he does tend to just take everything as being true because somebody like he trusted told him. So therefore it must be true. And I quite like that about him as well. But there we go. I think I've basically had one kind of vote for the folklore of magical tools next week, but again, I don't know if I actually want to do maybe a series on those. I have already got an episode on the broomstick, you see, so that's where I think I might end up revisiting those later in the year, because the broomstick one I actually want to update since I've done more research since then, so we'll see how it all goes. So I haven't 100% decided what I'm doing next week, so you'll get a surprise when you come back. As I say, stay safe, look after each other, look after yourselves, and I'll see you next week. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.